The Queen's usual impeccable sense of how to do the right thing was beset by the need for a new kind of emotional response. Her deepest personal desire had been to stay in Balmoral to console her grandchildren, and she resented public hysteria that told her otherwise. She grasped the enormity of the event, wrote Tony Blair, but in her own way. She was not going to be pushed around by it. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell. And if you are new, then welcome to this journey through Tina Brown's The Palace Papers. I hope to earn your subscription today. This is episode 3, and we are starting out today. We're partway through chapter 1. We are on section 3. Everything that we talked about last time was the complete position of things after Charles and Diana's divorce, but prior to her death. The first sentence of this section will change everything about the nature of the relationships, the dynamics, the stressors, the fears, everything that they were feeling in those moments prior to her death. For the Queen, the shock of Diana's death at the age of 36 on 31st of August 1997 was a traumatic commingling of the public and private. Diana was not simply her son's ex-wife, whose life had been cut short in a calamitous car crash. She was also the mother of the future king and the adored icon of the nation. At the rate of 6,000 an hour, people who had never met the Princess of Wales streamed into London to mourn her death. The diversity of the crowd, as much as the size, was a revelation. Old and young, black and white, South Asian and East Asian, wearing shorts and saris, pinstripes and hijabs, in wheelchairs and on crutches, carrying young children aloft on their shoulders or pushing them in prams. As the bouquets of flowers piled up outside Kensington Palace, and the death of Mother Teresa on September 5th went largely ignored, the troubled and turbulent Princess of Wales was on her way to becoming a celebrity saint, not just in Britain, but in every nook of the globe. No British royal in history has had such a magnetic hold on the world's imagination, a fact not lost on Prime Minister Tony Blair when he winningly declared her, on her death, the people's princess. So we'll continue reading, but I just was struck with the similarity. You know, we've been reading through Kennedy-related things, and one of the things that has always stuck out to me about JFK's death is that 2 other famous people died on the same day. I believe Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis, which C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors and just a preeminent thinker, writer, had a huge influence on that middle part of the 20th century. And yet his death was just completely eclipsed by the horror and unexpected death of JFK. And this reminds me of that Mother Teresa, who she had lived a full life. So her death wasn't unexpected. It was terribly mourned. It was a horrid thing. It was a sad thing for the world, but it too, in a large way, was eclipsed by this unexpected death of a global figure. The Queen's usual impeccable sense of how to do the right thing was beset by the need for a new kind of emotional response. Her deepest personal desire had been to stay in Balmoral to console her grandchildren, and she resented public hysteria that told her otherwise. She grasped the enormity of the event, wrote Tony Blair, but in her own way. She was not going to be pushed around by it. She could be very queenly in that sense. So there's this demand from the people that her visual response, her verbal response, should match their internal emotions. Their will prevailed. After 5 days of tumult, Her Majesty, with steely reluctance, returned to London for a public walkabout amidst the ululating crowds and flower tributes outside Buckingham Palace. She made a rare live TV broadcast to the nation, expressing an empathy she almost certainly did not feel. and she capitulated at last to the crowds and the tabloids' demand to lower the Union Jack over Buckingham Palace. I am told that Prince Philip regarded it as a great humiliation. You know, it's interesting. I think we all look back at moments like this and we wonder which thing was influencing what. You know, what was happening? What were they thinking? And was this just a PR move, or did it signal something that was actually a change in their posture? One thing that came to mind for me, because it's one of the few times that their standards were altered for the sake of empathy, was 4 years later, after 9/11, Buckingham Palace played the Star-Spangled Banner in solidarity with Americans on that day of our great tragedy. And I just wonder if perhaps the breaking of protocol to lower the flag for Diana made a little wiggle room, let in a little light into the possibility for Queen Elizabeth that later, perhaps breaking protocol for great tragedies might be the right thing to do. That yes, we hold our duty and we hold our traditions very carefully because they are symbols of the continuation and the steadfastness of a nation. However, sometimes we bend those protocols in light of something that's a massive tragedy. And I just couldn't help but wonder if her actions 4 years later to play the Star-Spangled Banner and to do things like that that were out of protocol were informed by this bending, that even though Prince Philip took it as a humiliation, that actually it was the right thing for the moment, that honoring Princess Diana, honoring the future king's mother, honoring the woman that everyone in Britain had been groomed and come to view as their future queen, and then have that taken away so recently in their minds, that for her to pass required this sort of honoring. What do you think? I'd love to know in the comments, especially those of you who are British citizens. Of course, you understand these dynamics far better than I do. I'm just an American processing through these things and intaking new information that's presented here in light of the historical things that we know. So I always welcome your input, whether you're a British citizen or perhaps a member of the Commonwealth nations, or like me, an American or some other nation that doesn't have any skin in the game, but it just enjoys the story. I would always welcome your input and your thoughts. If you have read about these things or just happen to know about them, you can always add those in the comments. All of us are made better for, even when there's a correction to something I've said, all of us are made better by those comments. So I always welcome them. Well, section 4 of this chapter starts out, the most awful task of Charles's life was waking up his 12 and 15-year-old sons at 7:15 a.m. at Balmoral to deliver the news of their mother's death. Sorry, I didn't expect to get emotional here. That really would be terrible, wouldn't it? Can you imagine? No matter what horror you were going through as a family, no matter how much angst and irritation and anger and fury you might have felt toward the person, you'd never want to do this. In a documentary on the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, Harry expressed a sentiment that seems forgotten in his more recent interviews. One of the hardest things for a parent to have to do is to tell your children that the other parent has died. But you know, he was there for us. He was the one out of the two left, and he tried to do his best and to make sure that we were protected and looked after. Prince William recalled, "The shock is the biggest thing, and I still feel it. People go, shock can't last that long, but it does." This is from an interview with Prince William in April 2017. He said, "Shock can't go on that long, but it does. And the trauma of that day has lived with me for 20 years like a weight." Yes. You know, we lived abroad for a period of time, and I remember somebody telling me that the weight of living abroad is something that always it's like an extra weight in your backpack of you're either having to speak in a different language, you're translating your known currency into the other currency. There's always a weight of living abroad that you just carry along with you, and it adds to your load no matter what. So you've got your normal load of life, and then you've got that added weight of I have to speak in a different language, or I have to think about my visa, or whatever it is. You've got added things just from having lived abroad. And grief is this way to me. It's this extra, if living abroad is a 5-pound weight in your backpack, this kind of grief would be like a 25-pound weight that's just always sitting there in your backpack along your normal daily tasks. So you still have to do your final exam. You still have to, try out for the soccer team. You still have to do all the things that a 12 or 15-year-old has to do. But you've got this added weight in your backpack that's just always there. And it makes every step harder, and it makes everything feel more tiring, more taxing. And you can't even quantify why you feel so tired. But certainly, what he talks about, it's lived with him for 20 years like a weight. I think that's a really good description. To me, it brought to mind the thing of living abroad, but any one of us, if we've had an aging parent perhaps live with us, or whatever circumstances you have in your life, there are things that just add like that, like a weight that you carry that people can't see, but it's there with you. The scramble to arrange Diana's funeral in just a week was fraught. The Spencer family didn't want any mention of the royal family. In retaliation, Buckingham Palace insisted they have a separate prayer for the royal family, and that the words People's Princess be removed. The disagreements among family members raged for 4 days. A person on the funeral planning committee told me the Spencer side had been saying what the role of the children had to be. Philip suddenly blasted, "Stop telling us what to do with those boys. They have lost their mother." His voice was full of emotion, a real voice of the grandfather speaking. It was also the voice of a man who had effectively lost his own mother at the age of 10. So you can see how each one of the players here would have brought their own sorrows to the table. My understanding is that Diana's parents had divorced, and so who knows what's happening in the Spencer side of the family as they grapple with the very public and horrifying things that had been said and done between the Waleses. But then also you have Prince Philip here, and his own grief is echoing. He lost his mother, he lost his country. He was a boy without a home, like we read about in our last episode, that he didn't even know where he was going home to. And so here he has boys, and they've just been trying to kind of cloister them in at Balmoral, and yet the pull of the nation, where they've had to do like this walkabout to go view the flowers and things that have put these boys in a position that he's probably imagining himself in. He's very likely able to identify with the horror that these boys are feeling, and feeling this lion raise up in him to guard them. And what a great thing for a grandfather to feel and to do. If he lets that former tragedy in his life inform his empathy, then that's actually a kindness to his grandsons that could have helped them and served them. One observer said that Prince William seemed consumed by a total hatred of the media, and he was refusing to walk behind the gun carriage. He and Harry were holding firm. Prince Charles, meanwhile, was supposed to be traveling to Westminster with Charles Spencer, but the Earl hated him so much he was refusing to be in the same car with him. Whew, that's hard. I don't know if you've been through situations where sorrow between family members affects some other tragedy. About 2 years ago, our family walked through 2 instances of this, each funeral impacted by other family dynamics that just complicate the moment of grief. And, I wasn't in the center of either of those. I was kind of a side family member, just observing both, but having both in close succession with one another really gave me the opportunity to observe the ways that this very thing is true, that a divorce happening its tendrils go into a moment of grief like this, and something that already is crazy hard and you don't want to be walking through. You don't want to be dealing with a poor 12-year-old and 15-year-old having lost their mother. Horrible thing. You don't want to have to be thinking about funeral proceeding decisions, something so practical and seemingly stupid in a moment like this. You just want to guard this 12 and 15-year-old and say, however long you need to cry, whatever you need to do, whatever needs to happen. And simultaneously, if we just take one person, take Prince Charles, the horror he would have felt, whatever he had felt in anger, irritation, etc., toward his former wife. In a moment like this, surely the grief and sorrow and tragedy of it all would have hit him like a dagger. And he would have been dealing with so many things. Then you've got Charles Spencer. You take any one set of people or any one individual, and the weight that the grief is placing on them is tremendous. But then to be forced to interact with people with whom you have ongoing disagreements is incredibly difficult. It really is. And there's no way for it not to be. When there's already family disunity, a moment like this is going to be made infinitely more difficult. Finally, Philip, ever the family decider, gently cajoled the boys with, "If I walk, will you walk with me?" He reminded them how these images would be seen round the world, though Harry still talks about the personal agony it caused. From the Crown's point of view, Philip was right. The unforgettable sight of 3 generations of royal males solemnly walking behind Diana's coffin made the powerful dynastic statement the monarchy required. There's a man in our family who has stood like this as a family peacemaker. He's a member of my husband's family, and he's getting up in years now. He's 91. And the last time we spent time with him, he was not well. And I was just struck as we drove away, and I was actually moved to weeping in a couple of different moments as I considered the infinite value that came from his particular role in our lives during moments of great upheaval. One in particular stands out to me where he served my husband and I and my husband's younger brothers back when we were newly married. This uncle stepped in and made some pivotal decisions and served us in very practical ways that we didn't even have the wisdom of life to understand what he was doing and how fantastic it was of a service to us. When I read about Philip, my husband's uncle came to mind and the role that he's played in our family, and I just feel so grateful, and it makes me as a human want to be the kind of aunt, future grandmother, and family member that can provide this sort of true peacemaking at times when life is already difficult enough, when sorrows have hit, to be the sort of person who's willing to do the hard thing, who's willing to have the hard conversation, who's willing to look further down the line and make a decision that is in the long-term best interest, even if it's in the short-term difficult line of things we can do. So I feel very grateful in this moment for Prince Philip, his role in the family, because I've experienced that in our family, and it's such a gift to whoever is a recipient of that kind of wisdom. Well, they make it to the funeral, and nothing could have shocked and outraged Her Majesty and Prince Philip more in their life than the accusatory oration by Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. And I read it, I just want to say, because of how it's described here, I went back and just read the entire thing, and I will say the first 3/4 of it were exactly what you might expect. Earl Spencer lauding Diana, talking about her beauty, talking about her influence, just doing what is normal for a eulogy. But the final quarter of it, I think it's actually really accurate. She says, His address was a hand grenade aimed at every sitting member of the House of Windsor. Addressing the young princes and the role going forward, he pledged, "We, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition." Blood family. He was intentionally setting the non-royal family as higher than the royal family. And it is like lobbing a hand grenade in the middle of this terrible event. So the whole congregation, except for the royal family, is now clapping. One observer said it was the sound of thunder. The archbishop was appalled and deemed that speech vengeful and spiteful. Prince Philip was so angry he had to be talked down afterwards by Earl Mountbatten's son-in-law. Very bold was all that the Queen Mother reportedly said between her clamped teeth. They all felt never again. On the Monday after the funeral, Tiggy Leggeborg, their kindly big sister caregiver appointed by Charles after his separation from Diana, took them to follow the Beaufort hunt on foot. They were greeted with all the right sensitivity by an old family friend, Captain Ian Farquhar, joint master of the Duke of Beaufort's hunt. "It's good to see you, sirs," he said to the shattered young princes. "I just want you to know that we are all very, very sorry about your mother. You have our deepest sympathy, and we were all incredibly proud of you on Saturday. That's all I'm going to say, and now we're going to get on with the day." "Thank you. Yes, you're right," William gravely replied, as if the Queen's stoic genes had fully asserted themselves in her grandson. "We all need to get on with the day." Harry, always more fragile, struggled mightily to manage without a mother. In the weeks after her death, to try to cheer him, Charles took his younger son at half-term on a 5-day tour of South Africa, Swaziland, and Lesotho, then sent him off on a safari to Botswana. I just noted, this is so kind. This is such a fatherly, careful gift that Charles gave to Harry in this moment. It was time together, making memories, doing something totally new that would not raise the sorrow of Diana, but would give him a new perspective, give him something fascinating and wonderful. And you know, we need both. When we're in the throes of grief, sometimes we need to sit and just feel it all the way. And we need to recall the memories, and we need to live with the loss. And also, sometimes we need to be reminded that there are new things, ahead, that there are new animals we can see, and new lands we can discover, and new memories we can make. And to me, this was a gift from Charles that was very insightful, very kind, very timely to his younger son. And later, we all know, Africa becomes a very central and important part of Harry's life. He thinks of Africa as his place of getaway, a place of truth, a place of letting down his hair and not having to be on. That impression that Harry still carries with him was likely formed during these years. He also, after Lesotho, he sent him off on that safari to Botswana with the former Welsh Guards officer Mark Dyer. Later, he recruited this guy as the boys' mentor. Dyer made the boys' day in Johannesburg by scoring him a backstage visit with the Spice Girls. And one writer observed, he said he was waiting to see if Harry would appear at the concert wearing a t-shirt and jeans, as he would have done with his mother, or a suit and tie, which meant the Windsors had prevailed, which is interesting that people were watching this at the time, and it shows the way that even Earl Spencer's grenade had achieved a purpose, which is now people are watching which family is going to win out. Are they going to be more like Diana, who in her cool, run into a workout in sweats or going out in her, cool glasses or whatever? Are they going to go with, daily, like, let your hair down style, or remain with the royal tradition of just always being seen in a suit and tie? Harry duly materializes in a suit and tie. And this writer says, to him, that signified that Diana's memory was already being expunged. I mean, I don't think that's entirely fair. This is a 12-year-old kid, and he's doing probably whatever someone else has packed for him. At the end of a trip like this, after you've been running around in the bush in your khaki pants or whatever, sleeping in tents and doing whatever you've done in Botswana, and then you get to go to a concert, I don't know, if you're going to dinner beforehand or whatever, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily erasing Diana for him to wear a suit and tie. It might just be, look, I had these trunks full of clothes. These were my safari clothes. Now I'm in my city clothes. I feel like this is putting a lot of credence in this one guy's opinion of what it meant. But it does show the way that Earl Spencer's comments had affected people's views of what's happening here with the boys. In his harassed, fogyish way, Prince Charles made every earnest effort to be an attentive father. He read Rudyard Kipling stories to the boys before they went to bed. He took them to Stratford-upon-Avon to see Royal Shakespeare Company productions. They would go backstage to meet the cast. Actor and writer Stephen Fry, who accompanied them to The Tempest, told me he was enchanted. So this is Tina Brown firsthand account again. I just want to point out to you guys, this is happening a lot. This is not someone, like if I sat down to write any biography, basically, I can think of only a few people that are biography worthy that I could even hope to have firsthand interactions with. But, she's got her finger on the pulse of lots of different people who have had firsthand accounts of the royals, including the royals themselves. And here we have one. Actor and writer Stephen Fry told me he was enchanted by how much the boys teased their father, which he thought was a truly healthy sign. It is a healthy sign, especially in these years after her death. It could be that everything gets really cold and formal. It could also be where there's a bunch of disdain and hatred and demeaning. So for there to be kind of a teasing back and forth banter where they kind of accept him, but also they joke at his expense, and he receives that really is a healthy sign of relationship, particularly, like we all know, in the royal family, the way that there had not been a significant amount of closeness between Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles in his childhood. And so for him to achieve this with his own sons, especially after such grief, is actually noteworthy, and it is remarkable. Despite Earl Spencer's vows that Diana's boys would be steered by his blood family, William and Harry were not raised as Spencers, but as Windsors. No more paparazzi-trailed school breaks. They holidayed almost exclusively at Balmoral and Sandringham, where Prince Philip regaled them with stories of military history and taught them to shoot. Their friends were the children of their father's circle. Mostly, it was Tiggy Leggy-Bourke, who had joined Harry on the Africa trip, who provided maternal warmth and structure. A jolly hockey sticks blonde from minor nobility, Tiggy was a Charles loyalist to the core, who believed that the boys should be distracted by fresh air, a rifle, and a horse. I think, you may not all know this. I know we've had some readers join us since I've talked about things, but I have a large family, and all but one of my children are boys. I have one daughter and a heap of boys. You can prepare yourself. I have 8 boys. And they range in age from 22 and a half down to 6 and a half. And I just thought, I wrote, these are pretty good insights for boys and for humans in grief in general. Fresh air, a rifle, and a horse. Like, you don't need to be sitting in your room all day, every day, just journaling and weeping and reading, sad poetry. Like, there might be a time for that to process through your grief, but also you need fresh air. You need activity. You need something like a horse that you can show care for and you can enjoy but also look after. It evokes responsibility and just a fresh perspective, and then a rifle to be able to learn something useful, go out, learn a skill, do something with precision and focus that gets your attention off of everything going on right here in your head. And I think this is really insightful. And, it's good that she was able to influence them in this way during this time. She did retain apparently significant respect in their eyes, especially Harry's, because in 2006, Harry invited her to watch his passing out parade as an officer at Sandhurst. That's his graduation parade. And then in 2019, he privately made her Archie's godmother. So she retained that influence. And anybody that would pour into your life at a significant time like this likely would. It makes sense that he's retained that special relationship. Tina Brown does give us a parenthetical piece of information that is very difficult and interesting. Martin Bashir, we talked about how he gave deceptive documents to the Earl of Spencer to convince Diana to do the interview. And all of that came out long after her death. Well, one of his worst calumnies was to tell Diana that Tiggy was having an affair with Charles and had had an abortion. In 2021, so this is just a few years ago, all of this happened back. Diana died in 97. Their marriage was finalized. Their divorce was finalized, I believe, in 95, 96. So this would have all happened in the early to mid 90s that Diana would have been told these things. And yet in 2021, Tiggy was reportedly offered substantial damages from the BBC, I guess once these lies came to light. So that is interesting. A draconian agreement with the press in the post-Diana moral reshuffle meant that photographers and royal reporters could rarely penetrate William and Harry's private terrain, that they were given a childhood. And, this is fantastic, frankly. We have this in America. I don't know if it's a tacit agreement or if there are official laws, but there are general rules around politicians' children that most journalists still follow. Now, there was we talked about this actually. We went through a book about Melania Trump, and there were some things that were done to Barron and said about Barron that were awful. But they were not by journalists per se. They were, celebrities who were crossing into the occasional role of journalism. But journalists in America typically steer way clear of presidential children who are minors. And usually that steering clear extends into the college years. Like the Bush twins were in college when their father was president, and the Obama daughters have been in college after his presidency, but both of them have, by and large, both sets of Obama girls and Bush girls were left primarily alone. Whether they did something great, whether they did something bad, they kind of get given a pass until you're perceived as entering the adult world. So we'll see if people do that with Barron in college now, but generally we do that in America. And it's good to read that these things were actually put into print because, we all know the crazy draw of paparazzi that Diana had. So it's good that they did this. It says here that some editors were almost grateful for the clarity of the PCC's editor's code of practice. This spared them from having to make editorial decisions. She says, according to Lord Black, who was then the director of the PCC, newspapers were constantly being offered stories about the boys from other boys at school, and liked having the protection of this code where they could just outright reject those stories. So that's an interesting idea, that the code actually permitted the editors to do what they were inclined to do anyway. But of course, the pull of money, the pull of publicity, the pull of selling papers would probably pull them toward the occasional story to publish if they didn't have this code. And so that editors ultimately expressed gratitude for it. I did note, it says the prince's holidays were similarly off limits unless access was choreographed by the palace. I just wanted to note, this feels very different from how Harry describes it. If any of you have read Spare, or if you've listened to his interviews on this subject, he speaks as if it was just a constant press parade, as if, oh goodness, we couldn't even go skiing without doing our press, whatever. And I think, pre-Diana, the agreement had been, we'll do a quick press photo shoot, maybe answer a few questions, but then you give us the day to just be left alone and ski, for example. This sounds like occasionally the palace would say, sure, we can do a quick photo op with you guys. But for the most part, that the rule was they would be left alone. Now, was that done in practice? I don't know. You guys who were around can tell me, but Prince Harry makes it sound like they were just constant. And actually, for these years from 12 to at least 18, it sounds like there was a pretty careful guardrail put up to protect them from that kind of exploitation. She notes, it's easy to forget now that the boys' famous fun-filled excursions with Diana to Disney World, cinemas, and McDonald's became iconic only because the press was always there, snapping, following, and making Diana cry. The contrast contributed to the myth that what the Windsors offered was boring and constrained. But in truth, there was more freedom for the young princes inside the royal cocoon than out of it. She talks about quad biking at Balmoral. I wonder if is that riding 4x4s? That's the mental image I could come up with. What's quad biking? Is it riding 4x4s? Is that what British people call it? Quad biking at Balmoral in the privacy of 50,000 acres of grouse moors and farmland, blasting pheasants out of the Norfolk sky, fox hunting at a thrilling pace at Highgrove. In the evenings at Balmoral, the whole Windsor family and house guests played jolly games of charades. And, I want to say I had this perception too. I remember the videos of them doing the log ride, Diana and the boys, and the laughter, and just seeming like, oh, she's helping them have normal every person experiences. They're getting to go to McDonald's. They're getting to go to a water park. They're getting to do everyday things and go to everyday places. And she did serve that role. She definitely did help them have some of that magic of childhood that perhaps could have been overlooked. I think it was overlooked in the person of Prince Charles. And so she was definitely seeing to something that Prince Charles, I think, has expressed value in. He continually praised her as a mother and said she was a very attentive and kind and loving and present mother in the boys' lives. That is interesting to me, but also this idea that we were presented with this picture of Diana as the fun, cool parent who does all this fun stuff. And then there's like the stoic, like even in that picture we just read of going to a Spice Girls concert in a suit. How boring is that? He's definitely a Windsor. But actually that the Windsors also had these moments, up at, out at Balmoral. They do put on their wellies, I understand, and go out for long hikes, which hiking is one of my favorite things in the world. And to have just bajillions of acreage where you can just go and see animal life and forests and go out to the middle of nowhere and feel alone. Like what a gift that is to a young prince, to any royal, to have some privacy, to have a forest in which you can just scream, yell out your grief, cry and no one will hear you, no one will photograph you. You could express the things to the wind and say the terrible things that you've been feeling and not have any of it blow back in an article. What a gift that is. So to have been presented with the contrast, but not be presented with the contrasting ability for privacy and space and exploration and boundlessness in a way that happens at Balmoral and Sandringham and Highgrove is unfair. The other observation I had about this is that actually, even though I think in The Crown, these family game nights were kind of mocked, like how stupid, how mindless, but sometimes like silly, mindless family games where we just all do something that none of us might choose to do if we were solo. We don't all sit around playing this game constantly, but something that brings us all together, gives us a few laughs, brings us out of ourselves, helps us connect with one another, helps us see one another, and gives us a reason to come together during the holidays. These family games sound really wonderful. It sounds very wholesome to me. and like something that many families could stand to implement a little bit more. Like, do you do those kinds of things in your holiday gatherings? I know this last holiday when we were at Thanksgiving, we had my parents here and we played a game called 5-Second Rule. It's one of these like kind of mindless games, and everybody's laughing and people are, like, I couldn't even think of the word. I meant to say this and I couldn't even think of it. And it's just silly, but it's 45 minutes or an hour of everyone laughing, making memories, connecting with one another, being silly, being enjoyable. And then afterward you have a slice of pie and you sit down together and you do something else. But I think these ways of playing games are actually like family glue, that when we mock them, when we get so cynical that we can't appreciate things like this, we are losing something as a society. And I think the Crown's portrayal of that is a loss. I think it's like tending toward, oh, what a stupid way to spend time. And maybe I'm overplaying that. I don't know. I'm going off of a vague memory of the Crown. But I do think that our society tends to have a cynical attitude toward things that perhaps are part of what glue us together. And I think we ought to guard those things more carefully than maybe we do. Princess Diana acknowledged to me, this is Tina Brown again telling us something personal, in June 1997, that she found it hard to compete with what Charles offered the boys at multiple royal homes. In the July before her death, she took them for a fun holiday at Harrods owner Mohammed Al Fayed's Saint-Tropez spread. It included sailing on a 15 million pound yacht, but the princes didn't like it very much. The flash and excess of the hospitality that Al Fayed offered, with groaning buffets, the palatial bathrooms, it embarrassed William in particular. At sea, he stayed below decks much of the time so that he could avoid the long lenses of paparazzi. In the post-Diana years, the boys could disappear from the media noise into the woods and fields of the royal estates. Windsor World gradually swallowed up the boys. Earl Spencer soon piped down. His own private life was consumed by his 2 acrimonious divorces, and he was not a central figure in his nephew's circle of influence. When William turned to him to urge Harry to slow down his rush to the altar with Meghan, the younger brother viewed it as a gross intrusion. So Earl Spencer had a pretty, it sounds like, peripheral influence in their lives, and that William was pulling him in after not having had much influence, sort of as a like, would you please just talk some reason into him? Like, let him know it's not just us having concerns about how fast things are going with Meghan. If you know any more about that, particularly whether or not there's something being overlooked by Tina Brown here, was there some way that Earl Spencer had more influence or more of a role in their lives than is being expressed here? I'd like to know. Diana's former circle was pruned from the boys' lives, though Harry often turned to his mother's scrupulously private school friend, grief counselor Julia Samuel, for support. Others of Diana's friends, however, faded from view. They did not retain an influence in the boys' lives. And, some of that is natural. Some of that is just the way that life goes. We can't all keep up with everybody. That's one of the kind of problems that social media presents. And honestly, I've probably hurt people's feelings over the years, but every couple of years I go through and just do a friend purge. I'm not trying to be ugly. It's just that there's only so many people that we can each keep up with. And I think social media places a weight on our shoulders that no human can bear. And that, this was a time when there wasn't social media. And so it was natural that people would fade from their lives if they weren't an active part of their lives because they had no ongoing relationship with the princes because their mother was no longer living. It's natural that those connections would fade. And I do think that social media places this burden on all of us to keep up with everybody all the time and to feel grief over every sad thing happening in the world. And no human can bear that kind of sorrow. No human can bear that kind of relational weight of always keeping up to the same degree with everybody. You just can't. If you've even gone through one move in your life, you find that the neighbor that you loved connecting with, and every time you were out raking leaves, you'd have a nice conversation about the new grandbaby or whatever. But when you move, you don't have those natural inbuilt opportunities for conversation. And unless you guys just developed a thick or thin, we're together, ride or die sort of relationship, that relationship is just going to fade so naturally. And social media sort of keeps us in this prison, in a sense, where we feel the weight of having to keep up with everybody to equal degrees. And I think this is a weight being placed on the boys' shoulders almost. Like, why didn't these people were snubbed. They didn't even get invited to the wedding in 2011. And it's like, well, their mom died like 14 years before William got married. So does he have to invite every single person his mom ever knew? Is that really the rule that any child has to go by? Is that every person that your parents cared about ever has to be invited to your wedding? I mean, I get that they had a very public wedding, and yet, is that really the standard for any human? I just think that's very irrational to me. Well, she gives the example of the Daily Mail's Richard Kay, Diana's favorite royal correspondent. He always had the inside track and talked to her on the phone the last day she was alive, but received no access to her sons. Now, some of that, again, is just natural. Like, they're going to have different people that they trust. They're going to have different people that they've formed relationships with. But I will say, Richard Kay and Richard Eden and Rebecca English are some of my just favorite correspondents. I watch Palace Confidential. I don't know if any of you do, but I love their show. They do a great job covering the monarchy. So if you are an American in particular, and you love these kinds of topics, that is a great succinct weekly show that you can watch that does a fantastic job. I think it's usually like 30 minutes, so it's not a long time commitment, but I'm like a regular viewer. I love the Palace Confidential crew. So I'll just mention that. We are almost done. We are on the last half page of this awesome chapter. By the turn of the century, the royals believed that the painful, institution-rattling crisis was something they could weather. And it was. If her untimely death was the first global electronic real-time saturation event, it's chilling to imagine how much more intense it would be today. Indeed, I think this was the first event in my life where I remember just being absolutely glued to the television. I think I described it 1 or 2 episodes ago. It was my first day in college. We had just set up our room, and then the news came across our little TV. I remember sitting down on the dorm room floor, and then as people would like drift by and they hadn't heard, they'd come in and be like, what's going on? And they'd sit for a while. They'd sit on the bed. We'd all just, it was kind of like grief and shock, and you just kept staring at like the red and blue lights circling, in that Paris tunnel. And all of our eyes were fixed on it. All of our thoughts were fixed on William and Harry. The whole world kind of stopped to collectively grieve. And it really was, I think, one of the first global events like that where we all just nonstop couldn't stop thinking about it. But if you would have that on Twitter, Insta, Facebook, YouTube, nonstop cable news, like, it would be crazy in a world like today. But even then, this was a different sort of event. I'm sure it is sort of the magnitude of JFK, where the whole world was knocked by this event. She points out that Martin Bashir's interview with Diana would be on loop playing on YouTube, cut up into clips, The banned pictures and footage of the princess dying in the Alma Tunnel in Paris would be all over social media. I think that's an accurate thing. For now, the furies of media blame and public censure abated. The Queen privately remained shaken by what her aides called the revolution. Her Majesty would not forget the time when her perceived aloofness from the British people's grief over Diana's death caused them to turn on her, or what she had felt obliged to do when Diana's coffin passed the palace. For the first and only time, except for a head of state, she waited for her, then bowed her head. Never again, Tina Brown writes. To me, the Queen's response to all of this, at the time, of course, it made people angry. A lot of people felt that she was heartless, cold, aloof, out of touch, didn't understand her people. I think it was a moment, at least from an outsider's perspective, it seems like a moment where the Queen was reassessing her people, and the people were reassessing their Queen, and each got more acquainted with the other, in this moment of collective grief. And I think in the end, it bound them all more closely together. I mean, we just saw, it's only, has it been 2 years now? 2 years, I believe, since Queen Elizabeth passed in September of 2022. But we saw the outpouring of grief. We saw the way that affected the nation. And it did indeed. The people came, they rallied. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the rest of this book, is the way that this reassessing of one another worked out over the next 25 years until her death. But to me, the way that the royals went through this event, particularly Queen Elizabeth, assessing grief, considering what they should and shouldn't do, being willing to fly the flag at half-mast, or for the Queen to pause and wait and treat Diana with the honor of a head of state. Again, just like we talked about previously, it's like these little occasional deviations from the norm show honor to an unusual circumstance, rather than holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition and being unyielding. I think that sort of posture of mostly we keep to tradition, mostly we only honor heads of state like this. However, Diana was a particular person in a particular category, and she's the future king's mother. And so we need to honor her. I think that was totally the right decision in hindsight, to honor her like that. Let me know what you think in the comments. This has been kind of a rambly episode. I don't always do this, but this time these stories felt appropriate. Sometimes we will blaze through without my personal commentary as much, although I do tend to always add a little bit of observations or insights. But I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you liked about this episode. Next time, just to give you a heads up, it's going to be good. Chapter 2, Sex and Sensibility, Why Charles Loves Camilla. That's what we're getting into next time. It's going to be a look at their relationship. So come back for that, and I will see you then. Take care. Oh, and if you made it this far and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Thanks, you guys. Have a great day.